You ever hear a helicopter crush 100 roses while a woman screams about HOA bylaws over a child's scream for help? That's what happened when Karen Whitmore blocked an ambulance with a folding table full of sangria and string lights, and I had to call in air rescue to save a kid's life, right through her designer garden. Welcome to the neighborhood war that turned into national news, and it all started the moment my neighbor Hank collapsed on his porch and no one could get to him because Karen needed ambience. That Saturday morning started like any other peaceful weekend in our overly landscaped HOA community, with sprinklers ticking on schedule and gardeners humming with leaf blowers. I was in my garage tweaking the drone stabilizers on one of our mountain rescue quadcopters when my home alert buzzed. It was Hank's medical band sending a distress signal. Hank was a Korean War veteran in his late 80s who had heart issues, and the signal could only mean one thing. I bolted out the door barefoot, grabbed the trauma kit I always kept in my truck, and sprinted across the cul-de-sac. When I got to Hank's place, he was already down on the porch, face ghost white, barely breathing. His wife Sheila was in tears, trying to call 911 with shaky hands. I dropped to my knees and started CPR immediately, barking orders for Sheila to get the gate open and flag the paramedics. My wife Jen took over the 911 call from her cell phone, providing real-time updates on Hank's pulse and rhythm. We had everything lined up like a battlefield extraction. Everything but one problem. The ambulance never came. After 8 minutes of chest compressions and counting, with no sirens in sight, I knew something was wrong. I told Jen to keep the rhythm going and sprinted toward the gated entrance, only to find the ambulance parked right outside the community fence. They were trying to get through, but the only road in had been blocked off completely. Traffic cones lined the street, and a pair of folding tables formed a barricade, covered in glass pitchers of fruit punch, donation jars, and pastel-colored cupcake. There were chairs, lawn signs, and a large handmade banner that read "Welcome to the HOA Garden Gala fundraiser." Karen Whitmore stood in the middle, wearing a ridiculous flower-patterned sun hat, sipping sangria like she was queen of the subdivision. I shouted for them to clear the way, explaining that a man was dying just up the road, but Karen raised a hand like a traffic cop and calmly said the event was too important to be interrupted. I told her the ambulance couldn't get through. She responded, and I quote, "If it's that serious, they can walk. This neighborhood needs charm, not chaos." I stared at her in disbelief, while 2 paramedics stood helplessly behind the gate, carrying gear but unable to get even 10 feet into the street. I snapped. I kicked over a planter and started hurling cones out of the road, screaming for them to drive through. Karen tried to block me with a tray of muffins and screamed at the paramedics that they didn't have HOA authorization. Eventually I shoved enough barriers aside that the ambulance could snake through the mess. The paramedics made it to Hank, and with combined effort, we got his pulse back. They loaded him up, barely stable. Time was lost. Damage was done. You'd think that would be the end of it. But no. Karen, instead of showing remorse, doubled down. She accused me of threatening her, destroying HOA property, and even demanded that the police charge me with assault for knocking over her hydrangeas. She filed an official complaint that same evening, claiming my actions ruined her fundraiser and traumatized guests. A local officer came by to take a statement and left looking more confused than concerned. 2 days later, a formal citation from the HOA showed up in my mailbox for unsanctioned landscaping violence, whatever that meant. But that was just the start. Karen held a closed-door HOA emergency session without any community notice and attempted to pass a motion banning emergency vehicles from entering the neighborhood without board approval during HOA event. Her argument was that flashing lights and sirens caused stress and violated the community tranquility clause. That's when I decided enough was enough. I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to nuke her garden party empire from the sky. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just some guy who tinkered with drones and lived a quiet suburban life. Before retiring, I coordinated air medical evacuations for military and disaster zone. I still had access to rapid response resources and clearance to conduct training drills for civilian emergency scenarios. I made a few calls to old friends in the mountain rescue network. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was preparing for inevitability, because it was only a matter of time before someone else needed emergency help again. And next time, I wasn't going to let a table of cupcakes stand in the way. So I filed the paperwork. Not just any paperwork. I applied for a temporary FAA clearance for rapid medevac simulations within our county airspace. I listed the coordinates of our neighborhood as the test zone and received provisional approval with one caveat. A pre-surveyed landing zone must be marked for helicopter access. And guess which part of the neighborhood was the only flat, unobstructed green patch in a 3-block radius? Karen's rose garden. It was poetic. It was perfect. I even called in a favor from my old air medic partner Dan, now a civilian chopper pilot who handled wildfire rescue drills in the summers. I told him to get his bird ready because I was about to make local history. Karen had blocked one ambulance. I was going to drop a helicopter in her tulips if it meant saving the next life. But even I couldn't predict what came next. Because just as we prepared for the training drill, real chaos hit again. And this time, it wasn't Hank. It was worse. A child. A fall. And a blocked road. The clock started ticking again. But this time, Karen wasn't going to get the final word. Not when I had a rotor spinning and authorization in my hand. Not when a kid's life was on the line. Not when the sky itself was mine to command. The next morning came with the smell of wet grass and trimmed hedges, but for me, it felt like the beginning of a military operation. I had spent the previous night laying out coordinates, marking up satellite imagery, and syncing my contacts in the rescue network. I wasn't just planning to teach Karen a lesson. I was laying the groundwork for a fail-safe system that would never let her or anyone else block emergency services again. I walked the perimeter of the community with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, recording viable landing zones, elevation data, wind patterns, and potential obstructions. I wore a reflective vest just to look official and carried a large map that made people think I worked for the city. When Karen spotted me near her property, she came marching across her lawn in her usual battle outfit, matching visor, floral blouse, and that permanent sneer. She demanded to know what I was doing near her rose garden. I smiled politely and told her I was marking a potential emergency evacuation zone, part of a county-wide drill for medevac preparedness. Her face tightened, eyes narrowed, and she immediately began recording me with her phone while barking questions like some local news anchor on a caffeine high. I answered every question calmly, explaining FAA protocols and the purpose of drills. When I told her her rose garden was the only viable flat area for a landing, she gasped like I'd told her I was digging a trench through her living room. She told me I had no right to include private HOA land in any simulation. I informed her that in emergency circumstances, designated evacuation zones can temporarily override community landscaping codes if approved by the county. She stormed off in a fury, muttering about lawyers, bylaws, and God's will. I wasn't worried. I had already filed the necessary forms. The FAA gave me a provisional green light. The county sheriff had even signed off, mostly because he remembered Hank's delayed ambulance and had a personal grudge against the HOA's obstructionist policies. Within hours of Karen's tantrum, an HOA-wide email went out accusing me of staging an illegal air drill and attempting to militarize the neighborhood. She warned residents that unauthorized aircraft would be landing and that her roses were under siege. I countered by placing flyers on every door explaining the importance of medevac preparedness and including a QR code linking to a national emergency response video featuring actual rescue footage. The residents, especially parents and elderly folks, started to see things my way. Some even knocked on my door to thank me. One guy brought donuts. Another offered to help cordon off the landing zone. 3 days later, we conducted the first dry run. No helicopter yet, just a full ground exercise. I had my team, retired EMTs, a couple of paramedics in training, and my wife Jen helping with coordination. We used CPR dummies, simulated extraction protocols, and live drone monitoring. We rolled a modified golf cart to mimic patient transport from backyard to landing zone. Karen, predictably, lost her mind. She screamed that we were trespassing, that our dummies were lewd, that our clipboards were forged. She even called the cops. When officers arrived, I calmly handed them copies of my permits, my credentials, and the FAA's provisional authorization letter. The officers shrugged, wished us luck, and left. The next morning, I woke up to an anonymous complaint filed with the FAA stating that an unlicensed individual was preparing an unauthorized helicopter landing near residential housing. Luckily, I'd seen this coming. I preemptively submitted documentation of every step, including GPS-tagged drone footage, time-stamped photos, and written consent from all necessary parties. The complaint was dismissed in under an hour. Karen's desperation was starting to crack through her polished exterior. Then came the breaking point. A 10-year-old boy named Max was playing in the big tree near the cul-de-sac with his friends. It had a swing someone had rigged with rope, and despite multiple warnings from parents, the kids loved it. That afternoon, Max fell hard. His head hit a large stone that edged the mulch bed. His friends screamed, and one of them ran to my house for help. I grabbed my medical kit and sprinted over. Max was unconscious and bleeding from a scalp wound. His pulse was weak. His breathing was shallow. I stabilized his head and instructed one of the kids to grab my wife. Jen was on it. She immediately called 911 and gave coordinate. I radioed my pilot friend Dan, who was already on standby. Within 2 minutes, he was airborne. Now we needed a safe, fast landing spot. I gave him the signal and activated the pre-mapped coordinate. Karen's Rose Garden. The only spot we'd flagged that didn't have power lines, fences, or sloped ground. I sprinted there ahead of the chopper with 3 volunteers carrying orange marking panels. As we started laying them down, Karen emerged in full fury, wielding a rake like a sword. She screamed that we were ruining her prize-winning blooms, and that if anyone touched her rose arches, she'd sue. I calmly told her a child's life was at stake and she needed to move. She stood in the center of the lawn and screamed something about communism and aviation terrorism. I raised a flare. Dan brought the helicopter in low and slow, kicking up dust and flower petals. The noise was deafening. Karen covered her ears and flailed her arms. When the skids touched down, she was still in the middle of the LZ, refusing to move. One of my tactical friends, retired Army and built like a refrigerator, stepped in and gently but firmly guided her aside. She screamed louder than the rotors, but no one could hear her anymore. The medic team rushed in, loaded Max, and lifted off within 2 minutes. The entire incident was caught on camera from 3 angles: drone, security cam, and by a teenager live streaming the whole thing. The video went viral in under 24 hours. Not only was Max stabilized and treated within the golden window, but the footage of Karen trying to block an emergency helicopter rescue made national headlines. Morning shows replayed the clip. Memes exploded. News anchors called it a miracle of preparedness. Karen called it tyranny. Within the week, she filed 4 complaints, 3 cease and desists, and attempted to get me evicted for orchestrating unauthorized flight activity. The mayor issued a public statement praising our neighborhood for conducting a life-saving operation and called for reforms in HOA policy to prevent emergency obstruction. Karen was served with a notice of inquiry into her handling of community resources. Her HOA presidency was under review. Her roses were gone. But the story was far from over. She was about to make one more move. And I was ready. The morning after the helicopter evacuation, I walked out to my porch and found a stack of envelopes shoved halfway into my mailbox and duct-taped to my front door. Each one bore the HOA letterhead and Karen's unmistakable signature written in looping cursive so exaggerated it looked like she was signing autographs at a fair. One envelope contained a formal HOA violation notice for aerial disruption of community peace. Another cited me for defacing shared green space. A third accused me of operating unauthorized military-grade equipment in a family neighborhood. There were 6 total, each more ridiculous than the last. I stood there in disbelief, flipping through what felt like a sitcom version of legal harassment. My wife Jen came out with coffee, took one look at the stack, and said exactly what I was thinking: she's lost it. Karen had completely unraveled. The viral video of her screaming into the rotors while a child was being loaded into a helicopter had now made it onto national morning news, late-night comedy shows, and even an online remix set to dubstep. One of the local florists had already renamed their thorniest, least popular rose the Whitmore thorn. The comments on the HOA Facebook page had shifted from polite frustration to open rebellion. People had screenshots of Karen's emails threatening fines over fence heights and paint shades, now being used as memes alongside her screeching face from the viral clip. It would have been funny if it weren't so tragic, because instead of laying low and hoping the storm passed, Karen decided to escalate. She called a press conference. No, not the city. Not the news. She invited a few HOA loyalists and had one of them record her standing in front of her devastated garden with a microphone and a printed backdrop of American flags taped to her garage door. She began by blaming me for orchestrating a media hit job, claiming the rescue was staged, the child's injury exaggerated, and the helicopter a publicity stunt designed to destroy her reputation. She said I was weaponizing trauma to undermine her leadership. That video, too, went viral, but not the way she hoped. People picked apart every second, zooming in on the wrinkled flag backdrop, mocking her claim that my helicopter pilot was a part-time actor, and laughing at her attempts to quote bylaws like they were federal law. One particularly brutal TikTok cut between her video and actual military footage of medevac operations with the caption, "Karen versus reality." But while the public mocked her, Karen moved in silence behind the scenes. She filed a restraining order. Not against me personally, but against any rotary aircraft within visual distance of HOA boundaries. It was a ridiculous, baseless claim, but it forced me to appear in municipal court to respond. I showed up in khakis and a polo, with a folder full of FAA paperwork, timestamps, drone footage, medical records from Max's evacuation, and statements from 3 eyewitnesses. Karen arrived in a wide-brimmed black hat, neck brace, dark sunglasses, and a walker. Her lawyer, who seemed half ashamed to be there, read from a prepared script claiming emotional trauma, garden devastation, and fear of helicopters. The judge asked one question: was the child's life in danger? When the answer was yes, he dismissed the entire order in under 3 minutes. After the courtroom debacle, something shifted. Karen had taken too many public losses, and she knew it. So she went quiet. Not in surrender, but in strategy. She stopped showing up to HOA meetings. She stopped sending mass emails. But I wasn't fooled. I'd dealt with people like her before. When loud manipulation fails, they turn to quiet sabotage. And sure enough, a few days later, one of my team members got a call from a county inspector asking about permits for helicopter training on private property. A complaint had been filed. Anonymously, of course. But the timing was too perfect. I contacted the inspector, provided the full paper trail, and offered to walk him through the entire drill on site. He accepted, arrived with coffee in hand, and left an hour later impressed, saying it was the most organized operation he'd ever seen in a residential zone. Still, the pattern continued. I'd get calls from city services, questioning everything from noise levels to zoning violations to use of airspace boundaries. One person even claimed I had installed radar equipment on my roof. That one actually made me laugh. But it became clear Karen was trying to bury me in red tape. So I changed tactics. If she wanted to fight in the shadows, I'd drag everything into the light. I started compiling every letter, every message, every interaction I'd had with Karen and the HOA. I cross-referenced it all with public HOA meeting minutes, spending reports, landscaping budgets, and fines issued. What I found shocked me. Karen had been rerouting HOA funds for years into what she called personal beautification initiatives. Her rose garden alone had cost the HOA over $14,000 across 4 years. She had labeled it as community front-facing landscape beautification, but none of it was on shared land. It was all on her property. She had installed custom sprinklers, decorative fencing, imported soil, and even paid for her gardener using HOA dues. I found receipts, invoices, and even contractor signatures that tied directly back to her. That's when I called Nate. He was a local investigative journalist who ran a podcast on small-town corruption. We met over coffee, and I handed him a file the size of a college textbook. He reviewed the documents and said one word: damn. Within 2 weeks, he aired a 3-part series titled The HOA Queen and the Helicopter Scandal. It wasn't just about the roses anymore. It was about control, abuse of power, misuse of funds, and the danger of unregulated HOA authority. The series exploded in popularity, especially because it featured interviews from neighbors, former board members, and even parents of the injured boy. Karen's final card came soon after. She filed a civil suit against me, seeking damages for emotional distress, garden destruction, loss of HOA authority, and public humiliation. She demanded $60,000 and a public apology. I countered with a motion to dismiss, citing her obstruction of emergency services, prior HOA abuses, and defamation. The court date was set, and I knew that when we got there, it would be the final round. People in the neighborhood started leaving anonymous notes of support on our porch. One kid made a drawing of me piloting a helicopter with Karen dangling from a rose vine. Even Hank, now recovered and sharp as ever, dropped by with a plate of cookies and said, "Don't stop, son. This garden witch's reign is almost over." But I wasn't celebrating yet. I'd been in too many fights where the opponent had one last sucker punch waiting. And Karen, for all her madness, was still dangerous. I kept my focus, reviewed every document, prepared every fact. I didn't want to just win. I wanted it to be so airtight that there'd never be a round 2. Karen had blocked an ambulance. She'd mocked a dying man, stopped first responders, and turned a peaceful community into a war zone of rules and roses. The next time she walked into court, it wouldn't be with a rake. It would be with no defense left at all. Courtroom day arrived with a kind of calm I hadn't expected. I'd slept well, eaten breakfast, and gone over my evidence one last time. Jen gave me a look before I left that said everything without a word. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been bullied into silence, every neighbor who'd paid a fine for having the wrong paint shade, every emergency responder who'd ever been delayed because someone with a clipboard thought flowers mattered more than lives. I walked into that courtroom not just as a man defending himself, but as someone dragging a mountain of truth into the light. Karen arrived flanked by 2 attorneys and a PR consultant. She wore a navy blue suit far too formal for the occasion, dark sunglasses like she was shielding herself from a blinding spotlight, and a scarf around her neck to suggest fragility. Her entire demeanor screamed manufactured sympathy. She looked at me as if she had already won. The room was packed. Residents from our community sat along the back wall, some in HOA uniforms, some in casual clothes, but nearly all of them watching silently. I spotted Nate, the journalist, scribbling in a notebook with a smirk that barely hid his anticipation. The judge entered and called the room to order. Karen's lead attorney went first, laying out a case built on emotional suffering and personal ruin. He described the helicopter landing as a reckless act that traumatized his client and caused irreversible damage to her home, reputation, and mental state. He painted her as a tireless community servant who had been vilified by a rogue neighbor with an ego problem. He claimed my rescue drill was a fabricated stunt designed to attack her personally and that Karen had become the victim of nationwide ridicule because of my irresponsible conduct. When he finished, Karen dabbed her eyes with a tissue she hadn't touched before the cameras started rolling. Then it was my turn. I stood up, opened my binder, and calmly presented every document, timestamp, image, and video in perfect sequence. I began with Hank's collapse and the blocked ambulance. I explained the timeline, showed the footage, played the 911 audio, and paused on the frame that showed Karen standing in front of the cones with a tray of drinks while medics waited helplessly. Then I moved on to the helicopter rescue. I presented the FAA authorization, county coordination, training schedule, and the emergency call from the boy's accident. I showed video from the drone, security cameras, and live streams. The room was silent except for the click of my slideshow remote. I concluded by stating simply that my actions didn't just follow the law, they saved lives. The judge didn't ask for clarification. Instead, she turned to Karen and asked her a single question. Why, on the day of the child's accident, did you stand in the designated landing zone and refuse to move even after being told a rescue was incoming? Karen stammered, trying to shift blame, mentioning property rights and her trauma from the noise. But the judge cut her off. Trauma is no excuse for obstruction of emergency services. She paused, then added, especially when the trauma stems from being publicly caught doing something objectively dangerous. The suit was dismissed with prejudice. Karen was ordered to pay court fees and was informed that a separate investigation into HOA fund misuse had been initiated by the city finance department. Her attorneys looked stunned. Her PR rep packed up quickly. And Karen, for the first time, didn't scream. She just stood there frozen, as if the weight of her collapsing empire had finally crushed the last of her denial. I left the courtroom to a small ripple of applause that the judge quickly silenced, but it didn't matter. I didn't need a trophy. I already had something better. The truth on record. Over the next week, everything spiraled for Karen. The HOA held an emergency election, and for the first time in over a decade, she wasn't on the ballot. 3 board members resigned, citing ethical concerns and undue pressure from Karen to fabricate fines and reports. One of them leaked emails she had sent threatening to revoke community privileges for anyone who supported my drills. The mayor issued a statement praising the handling of the medevac and called for statewide HOA reform regarding emergency lane access. The story went national again, this time focusing on the abuse of power in unregulated HOA. Karen became the poster child for what happens when authority meets arrogance with no oversight. But perhaps the most symbolic blow came during a weekend community event I helped organize called Heroes in the Sky. It was a charity fundraiser for emergency responders. We hosted it in the central park of the neighborhood, just across from what used to be Karen's pristine rose garden. With the support of the new HOA leadership, we marked off a landing zone in the same spot and invited Dan to land the helicopter again, this time as an honored guest. Kids gathered around in awe. Parents took pictures. Volunteers ran CPR demonstrations. We raised over $20,000 in a single day. Karen watched from her front window, curtains barely open. She didn't step outside. Later that week, I got a letter from the city. They were formally recognizing my efforts with a Community Safety Award. It wasn't about the medal or the speech. It was about something else entirely. It meant that when someone stands up against injustice, no matter how petty, polished, or protected it seems, they can make a difference. That someone standing between a child and help can be moved, one way or another. That people like Karen don't win in the end. They just scream louder until no one's listening. But the story didn't stop there. Karen, stripped of her HOA power, began trying to appeal the decision, filing nuisance claims and alleging bias, interference, even conspiracy. Each one was tossed out or ignored. Eventually, she stopped showing up to meetings. Her front lawn grew wild. Her flowers never recovered. She had become the very thing she once fined others for, a mess in a place obsessed with order. Neighbors started talking openly now, sharing stories about how they were afraid to challenge her for years. They admitted to hiding decorations, changing paint colors, even parking further away to avoid her wrath. Now they were rebuilding. The new HOA board implemented clear emergency access rules, formed a safety committee, and even installed community med kits and radios across key intersections. What had started as a disaster bloomed into reform. And me, I went back to my routines. Tweaking drones, walking my dog, checking in on Hank, and quietly watching from my porch as the neighborhood slowly turned into the kind of place I always hoped it could be. Karen may have planted roses, but we planted something better. Accountability, preparedness, community. She once blocked an ambulance with a folding table. I landed a helicopter in her yard. And somewhere in between, a neighborhood woke up and remembered what it meant to take care of its own. Weeks passed, and the dust of Karen's downfall slowly began to settle. It was strange how quiet things became once the queen of complaints no longer ruled the neighborhood. Her emails stopped. The constant flyers with citations and rule updates vanished. There were no more unsolicited HOA announcements about garden edging or trash bins being 1 inch too far from the curb. The silence was almost unnerving at first, like waiting for an aftershock. But soon, the neighborhood started breathing again. You could feel it in the way people talked longer at mailboxes, left their garage doors open, waved from porches without looking over their shoulders. People smiled more. The shadows Karen used to cast had finally lifted. For the first time since moving in, I saw neighbors I barely knew working together. Someone organized a weekend cleanup, and almost every household pitched in. People brought food, tools, kids, and music. The vibe was relaxed and cheerful, like a neighborhood trying to remember how to exist without fear of fines or surveillance. A few folks brought up stories of past HOA run-ins that they could now finally laugh about. One elderly couple had once been fined for having a lawn flamingo in their backyard. Another man said Karen cited him for excessive wind chimes, whatever that meant. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became just how much everyone had tolerated in silence for years. Karen, on the other hand, had become something of a ghost. She no longer answered the door. Her prized lawn had become patchy. The once perfect rose bushes were half dead, untended and brown. Her car, previously polished like a showroom model, now sat dusty in the driveway. Every now and then, someone would spot her peeking through the curtains. There were rumors she was trying to sell the house, but no sign went up. Perhaps she knew that no buyer would come without a long explanation about why her name trended next to a helicopter and a child's stretcher. Despite all that had happened, I never went out of my way to provoke her. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave when I passed her house. I simply kept doing what I had been doing all along, helping people. Hank had made a full recovery and returned to his morning walk. Sometimes he would stop by and sit on my porch, sipping iced tea and reminiscing about the old days. He still chuckled whenever someone brought up the helicopter. Said he never thought roses could be so loud when they were being blown apart by rotor wash. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A white envelope arrived, plain, unmarked. I opened it to find a single piece of paper. No letterhead, no signature. Just a handwritten note. It said, I shouldn't have blocked the road. I panicked. I thought it wasn't real. I didn't know the boy was hurt. I'm sorry. That was it. No name. But I knew who wrote it. The handwriting was hers. The ink slightly smudged, like someone hesitated while writing it. Maybe even cried. It didn't excuse what she did. But it was something. Maybe her first real moment of truth in years. I didn't tell anyone about the note. I folded it quietly and tucked it away. I wasn't going to use it against her. Not everything needed to be public. Not every war needed one more blow. Sometimes the best thing you can do with a small piece of peace is accept it and move on. Months later, the new HOA board asked me to help design a permanent emergency response protocol for the community. I agreed under one condition. The landing zone behind Karen's house would be preserved. Not as punishment, but as preparation. We turned it into a dual-use community space. A garden in the off-season, an open zone during emergencies. It had removable signs, guide markers, and even a memorial plaque with a simple message: "Preparedness saves lives." People respected it. No one joked about the roses anymore. The helicopter that once landed in fury returned again, but this time it came for celebration. The county organized a safety fair in our neighborhood, complete with food trucks, live demonstrations, and a rescue-themed obstacle course for kids. Dan flew in with his crew, and this time, no one tried to block him. The same neighbors who once stayed silent during HOA meetings now cheered as the rotors spun, their kids waving and wearing plastic flight helmets. I gave a small speech, brief and to the point, thanking the community for standing up and reminding everyone that true leadership comes from action, not titles. Karen never showed up. Her curtains stayed shut the entire weekend. But at one point, I thought I saw her silhouette by the window, watching. Maybe she was listening. Maybe she was remembering the day she stood in front of the very same garden, arms crossed, demanding silence while someone needed saving. Or maybe she was wondering what might have happened if she'd just stepped aside sooner. Eventually, she did move out. No announcement, no goodbye. A moving truck came early one morning, and by nightfall, the house sat empty. The for sale sign was discreet, but within 2 weeks, a young couple with a newborn moved in. They were friendly, curious, and completely unaware of the saga tied to their new address. We never told them. Why would we burden them with that history? It wasn't their battle. It was over. But the impact never really left. Karen had ruled with rules. She'd built walls with paper, fines, and threats. But all it took was one act of compassion to tear it down. One moment where a child's life came before ego. One helicopter that landed not for war but for rescue. That changed everything. It reminded people what matters. That a neighborhood isn't made of hedges and fences and bylaws. It's made of people. People who need each other when things go wrong. I still walk past that old garden sometimes. The new owners are rebuilding it differently. They're planting fruit trees instead of roses. They built a sandbox for their kid. There's laughter there now, the kind that echoes without shame. I like to think even Karen would hear it and understand. That beauty isn't control. That power isn't fear. And that sometimes, saving a life might mean crashing through a few petals. I never expected my quiet suburban street to become a national headline. I never planned to go to court, face lawsuits, land a helicopter, or be the target of an HOA president's fury. But if I had to do it all again, I would. Every minute, every report, every rotor spin. Because that boy is alive. Hank is walking. The neighborhood is healing. And Karen gave us the most ironic gift of all. She brought us together by trying to tear us apart. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about responsibility. About standing firm when it would be easier to back down. About knowing when to raise your voice, when to raise your hand, and yes, when to raise a helicopter. Because when you fight for what's right, sometimes the sky itself opens up. And when it does, you better be ready to land.